Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for turning up. I'm Eric Dawson. I'm manager of the McClung Historical Collection up there on the third floor of the History Center. And we work very closely with the East Tennessee Historical Society, who's hosting this event today. And want to always remind you, if you're not a member, I'm sure some of you are, but you can become one. Go to their brand new website, take a look there to see how to do that, or talk with someone here to find out how to do that. And I want to tell you about a few programs coming up. Next week, April 24th, we've got Bradley Reeves, co-founder of TAMIS, to come back, and he's going to share some home videos of Carl and Pearl Butler. That's the current exhibit at the Temporary Gallery on Knoxville country singer-songwriters Carl and Pearl Butler. He's going to be showing home movies and talking about their lives. And then April 27th, we're going to have a beginning genealogy class back in this building. So come sign up for that. If you've never taken a class with Ann Blomquist, she's great, very enthusiastic about the subject, and you can learn a lot. And then April 30th, the Historical Society's curator, Rebecca Piesheimer, will be here to teach you how to care for family heirlooms. So please, again, check out the website for more information on those programs and join us. But today's program it's a bit unusual. Rather than just have a historical lecture or just a PowerPoint of what we normally do, we wanted to do something a little different and talk about community collaboration and crowdsourcing and take a peek behind the scenes at what we do here. So recently we digitized and put on our digital collection a book of photographs that Jim Thompson took documenting the installation of the streetcar tracks from 1904 to 1908. And that's proved to be an unusually popular item on our digital collection. A lot of people have been sharing those photos online on Facebook and elsewhere, commenting on it. And we wanted to talk a little bit about how those photos got from the basement up on the digital collection and then shared with the world. And then how community members sort of comment on it and do research kind of for us and fill in the blanks. And so first up, we're gonna have Joanna Bouldin, who is the McClung Archivist, who does a lot of the behind the scenes work to make this stuff happen. She's gonna come up here and talk a little bit about the book and how what she does day to day to make sure it gets out there. And then the Knoxville History Project's Jack Neely is going to come up and talk about some of the photos. So I'll give you a little bit of history of the streetcar in Knoxville and take a look at specific photos. The History Project's also one of our great partners. We have a close relationship with them, and so they're part of the interpreting of when we make these things available. And then I'm gonna come back up at the end and talk about a few photos, but also go into sort of like a crowdsourcing aspect of our job. The idea that community members, some of who are in this room, will look at these photos and comment on them and share information about them and help fill in some gaps and enrich all of our lives. Anyway, I'd like to bring up McClung Archivist Joanna Bouldin.
Hi, as Eric said, I am Joanna Bouldin, and I'm the Special Materials Archivist here at the McClung Collection. The Special Materials Collection is around 10,000 linear feet of primary and secondary source materials with a focus on the history and development of East Tennessee. In general English, this is around 5,000 collections, and a collection can be anything from a single photograph or a group of multiple boxes of materials that we've organized and processed. This is one of our rows of 20 that we have downstairs in the basement of this building of compact storage where we store all of these collections that we have. In addition to this, we have over 400 drawers of flat storage for the collections of oversized paper materials like architecture plans, posters, panoramic photographs, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of material crammed into a little bit of space. Well, that's kind of a lot of space, but it is a lot of material. And so we thought it might be interesting to show a behind the scenes of how materials like our streetcar track album end up in our digital collection online. We receive these materials both by donation and also by purchasing them. And as the archivist, my job includes both organizing and cataloging the paper materials, as well as cataloging the digital images for online. Materials that are accessioned are entered into our computer inventory, and depending on staff and supplies, we may not be able to fully process a collection right when it arrives, but we can put it in the inventory and put the material on a shelf and note the location and what needs to be done. And so at a later date, we can both find it and know what we need to do with it. So we try to evaluate the material as it comes in for inclusion in the digital collection, but it's not always easy to determine if there are some gems hiding in a larger collection that we receive. Our digital collection was started in 2008 by Steve Cottam and Sally Polhemus, and it was intended to provide an online presence for the McClung collection, sort of exhibiting highlights and offering a sample of both our special materials collection as well as materials upstairs that are in our catalog collection. That's still how we use it today. We have now an archive space catalog, which gives a textual listing of the majority of our special materials holdings that are down in the basement with me. And the general library catalog will do the same thing for the library materials that are on the third floor. The digital collection helps provide even more access to materials that need maybe a more visual representation, such as the Thompson photograph collection or the Roger Howell photograph collection. Or it provides more access to materials that are too fragile for handling, such as our Lizzie Crozier French scrapbook or the Aurora newspapers from Knoxville College. So it helps us balance both patron access with preservation of the historical items that we have. And while our digital collection is a very robust 16 years old, the McClung collection is over 100. So, in addition to evaluating current acquisitions for scanning and inclusion, we also review previous accessions for possible digitization. Sometimes that involves just walking up and down those rows that you saw and seeing what catches our eye. And sometimes we run through the computer inventory to see what we've marked for scanning possibilities. In the case of this album, it came to McClung in 1988. Patron recently requested an appointment to view the album, and after looking through the material when I pulled it, I felt like it would be a good digitization project. It is nearly 800 photographs of Knoxville with identifications, which we love, from the early 1900s. The photographs were taken by Jim Thompson, most likely as a record of the progress of the laying of the streetcar tracks for the company that was in charge of it. And they show a variety of areas around Knoxville. Some of these neighborhoods and locations we have not had any previous photographic record of from that time period. So this album met a lot of our requirements for digitization. One, identified photographs. We love an identification, and these were very specific about both location and date that the photograph was taken. Second, it's a unique item. You're not going to find these images anywhere else online. We're limited in time and staff, which means we don't prioritize items in our collection that you can find in other digital repositories. Third, the material is fragile, it is very heavy, and it is awkward to view. So when we digitize it and put it up online so that people can look at it that way, it means it's handled less in the future, which will help preserve it. And fourth, it is of historical interest to the area. Not everything we scan is as popular as these photographs have turned out to be, since we do prioritize the historical significance of the object. However, in this case, we were able to get both historical significance and popularity, which is always a nice intersection. So I showed it to my boss, Eric, and he agreed, yes, this is a good album to digitize. And so I started thinking about how we could make that happen. We use an Epson scanner and how to utilize the equipment that we have in order to get the best images possible. You can see the book was put together with the wing nuts, screws, and so with bolts through the pages that were holding the pages in. So we fiddled with that a little bit to see if we would be able to take it apart, and we were able to disassemble it, which meant the scanning would be much easier and the risk of damaging the heavy album was diminished. The paper pages were showing signs of cracking, and with heavy books, it's always a challenge to get it upside down onto the scanner. So individual pages are much easier to do that with. We chose to scan each page in its entirety as well as the individual photographs. Using the entire page in the digital collection meant that you could kind of get the idea of flipping through an album, to see it. But for the most part, when patrons request to purchase the images, they want just this image on the page. And so to make it easier for them where they're not having to crop images and that sort of thing, we scan the individual images as well. That took about 4 months to do the entire album. And so while we were scanning the album, we made a spreadsheet of all of the identifications. So when I went to catalog the images for the digital collection, I was able to do that in about 6 weeks since I had a lot of that information already available and not having to re-reference the album. When entering the metadata for the digital collection, we put down the information that is with that material. And I would love to go down research rabbit holes with all of the things that I put up, but I actually only spend about 25% of my time on the digital collection. So I can't just dive into every item, or very, very little of it would actually end up online. So I'll hand things over to Jack, and he can tell you a bit more about what's actually in the book and the images that are able to be found inside that album.
Thanks. Joanna, and thanks. This is all about streetcars, and I thought it was important to tell people who might not know something about the history of streetcars in Knoxville, which is pretty robust. One of my favorite misconceptions about East Tennessee, and I hear it all the time, is that we're just too independent for public transportation, and this raises two weird notions. How independent are you if you're getting in a car and driving on public streets and paying the insurance companies and the gas companies and everybody else? Are you more independent than someone who has a dime and pays it to a local guy to get on a streetcar? But the other issue is whether it's independent or not, we depended on streetcars for a long, long time in Knoxville, for 60 or 70 years. Most people in Knoxville, up and down the scale of race and class and income, all use streetcars. But we began talking about rail service as early as the 1820s. It goes way back. Of course, we got passenger rail in 1855. Got rail streetcar, and that started convincing us that rail was a solution to a lot of problems, as it was. In 1876, not too long after the Civil War, we got the first streetcars in Knoxville. They were horse-drawn streetcars. And when I first heard about this, I thought this is some kind of rustic version of something people saw in the big city. Isn't that funny that we had some of the mule-drawn streetcars? But actually, New York City had mule-drawn streetcars before we did and after we did. This was standard, and the first streetcars were horse or mule-drawn. But these were independent lines that were run for profit. They were independent of each other within the city. There would be a line to Fort Sanders, and it would be different from the line that ran out to Chilhowee Park. And a lot of them were projects of real estate developers. People wanted to highlight a new part of town that people weren't living in yet, so they built a streetcar out that way. And not only would people see these new areas just riding on the streetcar, but they would say, "Gosh, the streetcar is here, so why not move out here? This is handy to get to town with." Most people didn't have any other transportation besides their feet in those days. Some people had, mainly farmers and wealthy people, had horses in a stable and back, but most people did not. Anyway, it was independently run, privately owned, but monitored and licensed by the city from a pretty early time. But there were, by the late 1880s, there were experiments with, still had horse-drawn streetcars, but there was experiments with steam streetcars. And the first one was actually the one that went out Elmwood, which is now Magnolia Avenue, out to Chilhowee Park. But it's interesting that we had 3 different conveyances of streetcars by the 1890s, and partly thanks to a guy named William Gibbs McAdoo in 1890. You might recognize that name if you know anything about American history broadly. He might ring a bell because he turned out to be a major figure in 20th century America. But he was son of a UT professor who actually was a secessionist. He moved to Georgia during the Civil War, but moved back to Knoxville after the Civil War with his son, William Gibbs McAdoo Jr. But he was a really bright kid, went to UT, did very well, actually what served as a U.S. deputy clerk when he was only 19 years old. He worked in this building. This was in 1882. He was in the federal courthouse working as a clerk. But he became an attorney, went to Chattanooga, practiced for a little bit, came back here in 1890 with this idea to build an electric streetcar. This was a brand new idea at this time, by the way. A lot of cities, including New Orleans, did not have an electric streetcar yet. And William Gibbs McAdoo wanted to introduce this in Knoxville. It caught on a couple dozen cities up north, but it was only a like 2-year-old technology when McAdoo tried it here. He built a streetcar. People liked it. They rode it. It did have a lot of problems, and he ran it for almost 2 years, and went out of business. Went into receivership in 1892. McAdoo was a restless kind of guy. He went back to Chattanooga for a while, went to New York for a while, was an attorney, had a lot of business in a lot of places. But he came back to Knoxville. This kept gnawing at him. He didn't like to fail at anything. And he came back to Knoxville in 1895 and actually bought up some of this streetcar that had gone into receivership. And as another guy from Ohio named C.C. Howell was doing the same thing, but very successfully, was building a modern streetcar system by combining some of these independent routes in Knoxville. But McAdoo thought he could do it better, and got permission from the county to build a connector to the streetcar line along Depot Street in 1895. While in kind of a hostile way, he and Howell were competitors for this whole thing. He denounced Howell, attempted to have a monopoly. Howell was from Ohio, and there's another guy named J. Simpson Africa, who was a big investor in Philadelphia. But they were part of this monopoly that McAdoo was trying to break, or that's what he said his goal was. But he got permission from the county to build a streetcar system in downtown Knoxville, but not from the city. And they were kind of upset when a day dawned in 1897, and they found out that workers were already tearing up city streets to build a streetcar line along Depot Street. Mayor High School was not happy about that. And they sent the police down to arrest these folks. McAdoo got an injunction from a county judge to get the sheriff's office and deputies involved. So for a while, the sheriff's deputies and Knoxville Police Department were on opposite sides of this thing that was turning into a riot down there. There were about 150 guys down there who were grateful for the work, who were tearing up these streets along Depot Street to build this wonderful new streetcar that the brilliant William Gibbs McAdoo was planning. But they finally put him in, arrested McAdoo. Actually, it did turn into a riot. Unfortunately, it turned tragic. There was an issue when they decided the police and the deputies were battling each other on Depot Street. The workers were in the middle, and they brought in the fire department. And the fire department had hoses, and they hosed down everybody on Depot Street and just tried to clear the place. And this angered some of the workers, one of whom clobbered the fire chief down there, and people saw what happened, and a policeman saw him and shot him, and he eventually died. But so this was a violent riot that happened as a result of this misunderstanding, we might say, about building a streetcar without city permission. But anyway, McAdoo was arrested. He was in the Knoxville jail that day, and spent some time in jail, came out and gave a talk about how he thought he was right, and he denounced the city government for preventing him to do what he did. He left town and never came back that I know of, actually not to live, not till later on when he was more famous. And this might be seen the ignominious ending for a reckless young entrepreneur, which McAdoo certainly was. But only 3 years later, McAdoo was in New York in charge of the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad Company, and he was building the first tunnel underneath the Hudson River. He was in charge of that. So he was connecting for the first time Manhattan to New Jersey, underground, under the river. So he was becoming a major kind of a star in New York. 20 years later, remarkably, still interested in railroads, William Gibbs McAdoo, the same guy who was in jail in Knoxville, was in charge of the whole nation's railroad system because it was World War I, and the Wilson administration wanted to commandeer the whole railroad system to better serve the war effort. In 1917, 1918. William Gibbs McAdoo was in charge of that because he was U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, the same guy who had caused a riot on Depot Street, a little part of Depot Street that we hardly pay attention to anymore. It's mainly homeless people down there now, but it's between the part of Depot Street between Gay Street and Broadway. Just an astonishing career he had. While he was U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, he also helped found the Federal Reserve Board. And it's considered kind of the godfather of that. He moved to California, was elected senator, U.S. Senator from California, and also co-founded United Artists in Hollywood. He founded a movie studio, the same guy, but ran for president at least twice in the 1920s, and played a role in FDR's nomination in 1932. He wrote an autobiography called Crowded Years, very appropriately, because he did an astonishing lot of things in his life. Whether they're all good or bad is up to you to judge. But anyway, this was very interesting side note. There's a lot more to that story. It's a very complicated story, and it's told more fully in Heart of the Valley, which you can get out from Tim from the gift shop out here. Still a standard Knoxville history that came out in 1976. But Mr. Patton, E.E. Patton, wrote a good piece about all that. But anyway, it was C.C. Howell, though, who was credited with making Knoxville's streetcar system a model system, even on a national basis, certainly one of the best in the South. Howell died in 1902, and it went through some other owners, but it became known as the Knoxville Railway and Light Company. And this was, it might be surprising to see Knoxville Railway and Light Company. What did they have to do with each other? Actually, those were the first two ways that people in Knoxville interacted with electricity. We saw the first lights ever. We had street lights on Gay Street by the mid 1880s, and then we had the next way that people interacted. People saw that and were amazed by it. But the next way people interacted with electricity was by riding electric vehicles. So this was what McAdoo brought us, and what was continued by Howell and others. So this is, we didn't have electrical appliances at home. It was long before radio. We didn't have electric vacuum cleaners or refrigerators or things like that yet. But electricity meant lights and streetcars. That's what it seemed to be for in the 1890s and early 1900s. But it's remarkable. Then in the 1890s, we still had some of the old things too. I think by 1905, you could a traveling salesman here who was trying to get to all parts of town might in one day ride an electric streetcar, then a horse-drawn streetcar, then a stream-driven streetcar, a dummy line, if you wanted to go to all parts of the city. So that's quite a variety of different kinds of conveyances. Meanwhile, people also had horse and buggies and during this time. Anyway, I would like to mention. I mentioned briefly that we had electric streetcars here before New Orleans did. New Orleans finally did get electric streetcars in 1893, and it's worth a footnote that their consultant on the project was a Tulane professor who was a kind of a brilliant genius of physics. He knew Edison and Bell, and he'd worked with them. And had been involved in all kinds of anything electrical he was fascinated with. But he was a consultant on the New Orleans streetcar system in 1893. And his name was Brown Ayres. 10 years later, he was president of the University of Tennessee. And Ayres Hall is named for the guy that helped establish electric streetcars in New Orleans. Anyway, everybody used streetcars in Knoxville. I can't emphasize that more. Rich, poor, black, white, it didn't matter who. Everybody used streetcars almost daily. And you can see from anecdotes how many different ways streetcars were used. The only ghost story I'd like to tell is one called The Beast of Middlebrook, and it's about the strange creature that was known to be prowling in the Middlebrook Pike area. And there was a bounty for who would kill this ghost, they call it. I'm not sure. And we know now, we're much smarter now. We know that you can't kill ghosts with a gun, but they weren't so smart in those days. They actually, these young hunters, these bounty hunters, would go out on the streetcar loaded with shotguns, riding a streetcar out to kill a ghost on Middlebrook Pike late at night. That's a comical scene. Another comical scene is one we ran across when we did the historic Bouldin book. And what other city might have had a story like this in it? This is extremely urban and extremely rural. A streetcar is a very urban conveyance, an electric streetcar especially. But on the Lions View streetcar in the 1920s, a guy was captured. A chicken thief was captured with his chickens. He had stolen a bunch of chickens in Bearden and was trying to bring them downtown to Knoxville to sell. And he had them in sacks. This sounds like a Snuffy Smith scene, but except with streetcars. But that's just such an extreme contrast to me that we had to include that in the book. But speaking of Lions View, Cherokee Country Club was founded in 1907, and this tells you something about how many different people use streetcars and depended on streetcars. At first, they had a wagon. Nobody lived out that way in those days. Remember, 1907, it was just an 18-hole golf course with like 3 or 4 wealthy people living nearby it. Most people who used Cherokee Country Club in the early days were people who lived and worked downtown. It was an exotic, crazy place to go for them. And they first had a wagon, but then they had, by 1912, 13, they had a streetcar out to Lions View. And if you can imagine people loading up with the golf clubs on their shoulder and getting in a streetcar to go play golf, and then get back in the streetcar to come back downtown where they lived. That was what they did. That was the main way to get to Cherokee Country Club for the early members. That's something to remember in all this. Later on, the Lions View streetcar became a rubber wheel experiment in the 1930s. But in the early days, it was a standard rail streetcar. But Lions View streetcar also has its own Rosa Parks story. In 1926, a black woman who was a domestic servant named Fannie Lane got on a streetcar in the Lions View area and got in the front. She sat down right in the front of the streetcar, and this was kind of it depends on how much enforced segregation was. Depends on who the driver was and who the other passenger was. A lot of drivers didn't care, and unless a passenger complained, they kind of left people alone. But in 1926, a passenger complained. What was this black woman doing sitting in the front of the streetcar? And they ended up having to put her off, and it was I think they put her off in Cumberland Avenue area. So she had to walk home, and she was angry about it, and she ended up, I think, going to jail for a day or so about it. But it was she didn't have an organization behind her like Rosa Parks did. But that's why we have not heard of Fannie Lane's name. But she was, I think, equally bold. Anyway, that was. Those are some of the stories. But my favorite story about showing the range, it wasn't just working class people or who rode streetcars, comes from a guy named John Webb Green, who's one of several people who I think should be much better known to Knoxvillians than they are. A lot of people are remembered well, and some people are just almost forgotten. But John Webb Green was originally from Mississippi, but he was a very successful attorney here. And actually had his office right across the street in the Burwell building. But he had the firm of Green and Webb. Webb was Daniel Cleary Webb, who was his relative from Middle Tennessee. But John Webb Green was a lot of things. He was the guy that helped establish Fountain City Park as a public place. He much later, in very late life, he has helped establish McClung Museum at UT, named for his father-in-law as a memorial. But he was also the reason that we have a Webb School in Knoxville, because his partner Daniel Cleary Webb was the father of Bob Webb, and that's why the Webbs came to Knoxville to be with John Webb Green. But he lived like a very rich man. He had a big house on Black Oak Ridge. And he at least twice took year-long cruises around the world with his wife and wrote about them. They're fascinating travelogues. But he, despite living like the wealthy elite and being connected, and his wife, by the way, was a McClung, so she had a lot of money of her own. But despite this, he was not aloof. He believed so firmly in public transportation that every morning he would get his chauffeur to drive him from his home on Black Oak Ridge down to the Fountain City trolley stop. And he would take the trolley into Knoxville. And he said, I believe in public transit and I don't have time to drive a car. I would rather, and trolleys are smooth enough that I can work on briefs while I'm riding in. But he would get off and work at the Burwell building and then get on a streetcar and go back home. So everybody, my point is that everybody used streetcars, and they were wonderful in a lot of ways. They did have some problems. One I've been kind of surprised to run across when I first began researching Christmas in Knoxville history, because Christmas Eve was a time for pranks, and one of the favorite pranks of Knoxville teenage boys was greasing trolley tracks, and this was and they would do this often on a hill where a trolley would sometimes slip backwards. Sometimes it was just a headache, but sometimes there were accidents with injuries as a result of this. But that was one problem. One was that there were occasionally worker strikes, and this was actually came to a head in the streetcar riot of 1919. When you talk about the streetcar riot, you might be talking about the streetcar building riot in 1897, but the streetcar strike of 1919 was another one. It's been overshadowed by the race riot, which was just a few weeks earlier. But there was a big streetcar strike going on, and they brought in the National Guard to try to take care of it, and they actually camped over near the streetcar power plant, which was built in 1905 over off Winona, in actually the same place where CAT has its facility there near Caswell Park. But there were some deaths attributed to the streetcar riot as well. But anyway, streetcars were so extremely popular, especially on holidays like Labor Day and 4th of July, when we would all go either to Fountain City Park or to Chalway Park for big events there, big public events there. And these were supported by the streetcars because they made a lot of money on these days. But I found a figure for July 4th, 1899, 35,000 rides on that day, if you can imagine that. And these streetcars would just go back and forth constantly to these very popular places. And then, of course, the Conservation Exposition of 1913, 1 million people went to the Conservation Exposition in 1913, and most of them arrived by streetcar, whether they were from East Tennessee or from New York or elsewhere. They came from all over the country for that. But that same year in 1913, the streetcars, the Railway and Light Company reported 13.5 million rides on the Knoxville streetcar system. By that time, they had 53 miles of track and 158 cars, if you can imagine that. It became just part of Knoxville's culture. And of course, James Agee described streetcars in detail. He talked about his life on Highland, and he mentions pedestrians and horse carts and other things, but he goes into much more detail describing streetcars poetically. This is Agee from summer 1915. A streetcar raising its iron moan, swimming its gold windows, and straw seats passed and passed and passed, the bleak spark crackling and cursing above it like a small malignant spirit set to dog its tracks. You probably know he's referring to the electrical connection to the line that gave the streetcar its power, the electrical line that ran above all the streetcars, including even the rubber tire streetcars that were on Lions View. But it reached its peak in 1923 when 19.6 million rides were registered on Knoxville streetcars. But then it declined after 1930. And what happened? Of course, the Great Depression was part of it. But the main problem was automobiles. In some cities, you might have heard automakers deliberately purchased streetcar lines to shut them down so that people would have to buy cars. And this did happen in some parts of the country. I can't find any evidence that happened in Knoxville. But it was partly competition was part of the issue with streetcars as cars became common and stylish. People drove cars, and also by 1917, when we had annexed a lot more of the city, including Sequoia Hills, there were places in town that weren't as close to streetcar lines as most places had been before. And cars seemed more convenient, although, of course, when people get into the cars, they don't think about all the things that they do and pay for to make that happen. But purchase, fuel, maintenance, insurance, taxes for paving, all these things go into the apparent simplicity of getting in an automobile. But it's also partly automobiles demanded more roads, especially when the Dixie Highway came through and we began paving roads. And this was a big problem when there was a streetcar tracks there. We had to either move the streetcar tracks to one side or the other or put them down the middle. This became more and more of a problem. So by the 1930s, the city was more and more concentrated on building roads, building and improving roads, widening roads. And this always streetcar tracks were a problem for the road widening projects, and it kind of the city government almost became an enemy of the streetcar tradition in Knoxville. We had the last run of the streetcar in 1947. I think we have a film of that we're going to show later. But there was a shift to buses at that time, and it's interesting that up to this time, streetcars were profitable. They were very profitable. You didn't even have to think about subsidizing them because everybody enough dimes and you've got a profit. But it's had enough riders to be profitable until 1970, which is when the city first started subsidizing public transportation through buses. But we still find tracks, as you know. You probably noticed streetcar tracks emerging from the pavement all over town. But one of the most dramatic things was on the Hunter Block about 10 years ago. When some steam shovels were trying to pull up the streetcars, and they had streetcar tracks, and they had a hard time doing it. It was like a tight violin bow, and it kept slipping out and go doing, and it would slap back down. But anyway, we're going to show some pictures from the height of the streetcar era from 1905 to 1908, and these pictures you're going to see are all from before the Bijou Theater was built, just to give you some perspective. But this was when the streetcars were well established within the old part of the city, but was expanding into the suburban areas. But anyway, if I can leave you with any impression, it's when people say Knoxville's too independent for public transit. Well, for 60 or 70 years, we relied on it completely, and like I say, up and down the social scale. But anyway. Eric, what do we do next? Are we going to show some pictures now? Oh yeah, okay, good. I'll show the pictures we got, and thanks to my colleague Paul James for helping assemble these. But I want to mention these. A lot of these look kind of bleak. They look like a city on the edge, but we're seeing the rough edges of Knoxville, the new places that they were just beginning to build. So you'll see lots of piles of dirt and things like that. But these were just kind of the outer sides. We don't see many pictures of the busy parts of town like Market Square, but these are kind of in this era. And also the pictures are, in my opinion, probably not as good quality as the ones taken in later year in his career. Jim Thompson was just between the ages of 23 and 26 when he took these pictures. So he's a very young man. And this is just at the beginning of his career that would later become much more famous in the Smoky Mountains and National Park era. Anyway, so yeah, this is one I wanted to show. This is Main Avenue looking west from Prince Street. This is one of the few pictures of downtown as we know it. But I wanted to show it that the Main Avenue was. It shows that Main Avenue is very residential. Look at those giant houses there right on Main Avenue. A lot of the wealthiest people in Knoxville lived on Main Avenue in 1906, 1907.
Can we turn the house lights down a little so we can see that?
Oh, sure, yeah. Okay, this is this is called the Church Avenue extension, laying rail on Patton Street. Patton Street, you might know, I think we just lost the very last bit of it a few months ago. It's where the baseball stadium is. But Patton Street was parallel to Central Street, and this is an area that was urban renewal away in the 1950s and 60s. But as you see, it's a neighborhood, and even has a corner saloon, the East End Saloon, there on the corner of East Church and Patton Street. Here's I didn't notice this at first until Paul and I were working on this and zooming in, and it's rare to see. We had 106 saloons in Knoxville. We have pictures of 3 or 4 of them from that era, and I'm glad that we have one more through this one. And here's a picture of the Tennessee River Bridge at Gay Street. And if it doesn't look like Gay Street, it's because you see houses on both sides. The river end of Gay Street was mainly residential. That last block or so where the Andrew Johnson building is, was where there were lots of houses of middle class and up on that end. Actually, the last 2 blocks or so there. But this is a great picture of the same Gay Street Bridge we use today. And there's a little bit closer. Yeah, this was especially interesting to us, me and Paul, because we're working on the South Knoxville history this year, and we're trying to collect as many images as we can. So if you have any images of South Knoxville you think are not well known, we'd love to see them. All right, this speaking of South Knoxville, this is Island Home, the Island Home entrance, and it's undated, and we've wondered about whether this might be from a later period, but it's very close. It's probably 1910, 1915, maybe, or it could possibly be that old. But Island Home, of course, was just being redeveloped from Perez Dickinson's old farm, his model farm out there, which became a neighborhood in years to come. And yeah, there's another picture of that car. That's a pretty old one. All right, this is one that caught my eye especially because this is the Oak Street extension at Asylum Avenue. This is on Western, and you might recognize one building that's still there. The building on the left is the Prince Building, which is still there and is still used. Back then, it was we looking a little bit closer. It was a saloon in that building, and I think it was the saloon of one of the saloons of Daniel DeWine, who later helped found St. Mary's Hospital with his saloon earnings. But this is still the saloon era. We banned saloons at the end of 1907, so most of these are still the saloons era. But this is right on the edge of Mechanicsville, and it's an interesting trapezoidal building. Built in 1904, and it's interesting, I found that almost all of our trapezoidal odd-shaped buildings were built about that same time, including the ones on Central and Broadway and another one in Mechanicsville, kind of Flatiron style buildings. And in fact, the Flatiron building in New York was built at about the same year as well. And just suddenly, it seemed like a great idea at the time, and we just dropped it all together to build buildings exactly to fit angular lots. All right, this is a South Knoxville shot. This is on Sevierville Pike in South Knoxville, or just I think it's what we call Sevier Avenue now. But the M.A. Wallace property, it's the South Knoxville Baptist Church is on the left there. And it was rebuilt twice since then. But this was later Berry Funeral Home. So there's some great shots. Here's just a good picture of guys working. This looks like a Ken Burns sort of shot where you could kind of depict almost anybody and use it. Mainly African American, but a few white people in the picture too. Just workers working away on these streetcars, and it was a titanic effort, but they knew how to do it, and it was a big effort, but worth the trouble. And here's an interesting one that we used last year, Central Avenue, looking west from Pearl Place. You might not recognize it at first, but we're looking right into Happy Holler, and you can see the holler part itself there. The area where the old Sears building would be on the right, and Three Rivers Market. But looking down at these pictures, one of them, the second house from the street, is the house that at this time the family of Larkin Brown from Rhode Island, who had a son named Clarence Brown, they lived in that house at the time this picture was taken. I don't know if we can focus it in and see this young future genius of Hollywood sitting on the porch or something, but that was one of 4 houses where they lived in that general area. But you see the guys working farther down near I guess Anderson Street, where they're actually laying rails. And here's an interesting picture of West Fifth Avenue from east from Broadway. This is if we zoom in a little bit, Paul and I had looked at this, and Paul has identified the church on the left as it's a Presbyterian church, the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, and the one on the right is the old German Lutheran Church, which is now known as First Lutheran. This was the German language. We had 2 Lutheran churches, one that spoke German and one that spoke English, and they were both very close to each other. But this, if you preferred to hear your services in German, you would go to that one. But this is just an especially interesting scene. Anyway, but here's Broadway looking north on Fifth Avenue. You might recognize something in this picture, although most of this scene has changed very much. But that's Old Gray Cemetery on the left, and I'm going to give a tour of Old Gray in about 2 hours. I'm thinking about that. Yeah, we do it rain or shine. So, anyway, that's of course Old Gray, which was built for horse and buggy traffic, and I always warn people driving out of there because this is not built for people to be able to see what's in the street as you're driving a car out of it. I never actually park in it. But on the right is what had been the Central Market, which closed about this time. The Central Market was meant to be a rival to Market Square that was easier to get to by residents and farmers. And we now know it as Emery Place. This big open space there is now Emery Place, and I think it was just becoming. This was taken 1905, just about the very time that they were calling it Emery Park, named for Isaac Emery, who was I think the most famous person killed in the Newmarket train wreck of 1904. He was a minister from New York who had brought the idea of Sunday schools to Knoxville, but the city was so grief-stricken by his sudden and unexpected death that they named our first city park ever, and it was just because we'd just torn down the market house. They called it Emery Park in his honor, and it was a park for many years. And this is also where the dummy line would leave from. If you would catch the dummy line to Fountain City, you would come up here. Yeah, here's a bit of closer picture of Old Gray as we know it today. And you can see a few graves that are still there, of course. And here's on the right side where more the Emery Park area. You see a Bull Durham ad there.
Yeah, is that Broadway Baptist in the very back up there?
That's a good question. Do you know that? We're wondering about that. There's a big church in the back. Is that what Broadway Baptist is? Is that a great big tower?
It looks like the old one before the
Yeah.
fire. Yeah.
I bet you're right. There's so many big grand buildings that have come and gone over the years, and I gave a talk about church histories, and there, 50 or 60 churches have been built in the downtown area, but have all been abandoned or burned or whatever over the years. But I appreciate identifying that. And here's the Clinch Avenue Viaduct, lane rail looking west is what it said. This is, of course, looking toward what we know is Fort Sanders now. It was called West End back then. But when they built this 1905 or so, the Mayor Gass, who's the only mayor we have in Knoxville history who completely vanished from our history. We don't know what happened to him, when he died, whether he died, where he's buried. But he made a show of opening the Clinch Avenue Viaduct by letting his 5 or 6 year old daughter drive a horse cart across it. It just kind of is a kind of a spectacle. But that has been replaced. I think the original, it might be part of the original arches are beneath this, but they've replaced the platform. And here's another shot of that. But yeah, Knoxville is a city of viaducts. Of course, we're all built on a bluff downtown, and so we're connected in almost all directions by bridges like webs. Okay, here's Whittle Springs. The Whittle Springs was developing a reputation as kind of a pleasure resort. This is before the famous Whittle Springs Hotel that some of you may remember, before it was even built. But Whittle Springs was a place known for its springs, and they advertised medicinal waters. Later had to say, well, no, they're not so medicinal after they were sued or something. But this was Whittle Springs, of course, where Whittle Springs Golf Course is today, and they had a big swimming pool there one time. But it was already by the early 1900s, when people didn't go to the beach, they went to springs resorts. That's where they went to relax. And it was.
Is that the present day Walker Boulevard?
I think this is very close to that spot. Yeah, I think you're right. And here's a little bit closer shot. And here's what we think is the old train station up at Fountain City, next to the Fountain City Park. A very very good looking station there. And I think this is Hotel Avenue in the foreground. But right in Fountain City Park is just beyond that. As I mentioned, John Webb Green was behind making that available to the public as a park. Another shot with a streetcar sitting there waiting for you. The dummy line went electric in 1905. I think it was only a steam line for about 15 years, and they actually made it connected to the rest of the electric streetcar system in 1905. And here's Fountain City Lake. This has been identified that way. It's puzzling to me because it doesn't look like Fountain City Lake today. It doesn't have the walls around the edges, but we have speculated they may have been added later. There's a big, interesting looking house in the back, which may or may not be connected to the old hotel. I'm not sure. But
that was probably Fountain City Church.
Oh, you think so? Yeah. Yeah, I don't know that, but this. Let's see, and this is actually these are. Is that the end of our? Yeah. Central West. Yeah. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to. I don't know what I touched, but oh, okay. Okay, yeah. I'll let Eric take over.
Thank you, Jack.
Yeah. Thank you.
So that was really interesting because we had some like real-time sort of crowdsourcing and the idea of how to identify these things. If it's a nice big landmark like a Tennessee Bridge or whatnot, it's really easy and great. But in this case, we had Ronnie sort of identifying the church and then people thinking the Fountain City Church in the background is what it was. So when we're looking at these pictures, sometimes it's obvious, sometimes there's a little more work. In this album, it's really interesting because the different pages, this is like what one of the pages looks like. And the dates and locations and job numbers are not related. So that's labeled if you can read it. Up there in the corner, we've got Sevierville Pike. And then we've got Central and Broadway, Asylum Avenue, and Circle Park, Yale Avenue. So that's spread all over the place. And it would be maybe easier and preferential if it was more sequential and it would help us sort of identify the line, but that's not the case. So we do rely on sort of like, context clues and people helping us out with this. This was labeled South Knoxville, end of the line on Sevierville Pike. Does anybody recognize that house? I don't either. And so what we start looking at after that is we've got hills over here behind it to the right. And then you can see a train and there's almost like a train station or covering there. So I wonder if that isn't maybe over by the Southern Railway Brickyard. That's just sort of like over across the river there. Somebody's going to figure this out eventually, no doubt. But because that's quite a house. At first, I thought it might have been Landing House, but if you compare the architecture, even with changes over the years, it's probably not going to be the case. And here we have Central Avenue west from Broadway, and I just wanted to show this one because it's such a popular intersection. Everybody's familiar with it. I go by it every day, and this is what it looked like in the early 1900s. And it's interesting, Jack and I did not really compare notes or converse about which pictures we were going to show, but we both chose pictures with taverns for whatever reason, which is what you're going to see over here. And then there's a horseshoeing place ran by Alt on this side of it. And of course, that today is where there's a parking lot and the closed Regions Bank. And that's closed as well. I think it was Carpet headquarters. Asylum Avenue and Broadway looking west from Bridge. Surprise, surprise, another tavern or restaurant there. And I chose Asylum Avenue, this picture in part just because of the recent development going on there and the reopening and naming of things there. Asylum Avenue was a really major road. It basically started at Walnut and ran all the way to the city limits at Clinton Pike at the time. This would have been around the area where Western and Summit Hill meet at Broadway.
What asylum was it referenced? What asylum?
There
was it was the school for the deaf and the dumb, blind.
That was just what they called the school for the deaf back then, the deaf and dumb asylum. Asylum is an old word that means safe place. And it really wasn't until the 20th century that it always began connected to mental hospitals. But they changed the name for that reason in the 1920s because they didn't.
What's it called now?
It's called Western Avenue.
Oh.
Yeah.
And from this picture, that would have been right around this area, right in that direction. The asylum would have been, and further down, of course, would be the L&N station.
Yes, that LMU law school was where the deaf and dumb school was.
And then I really like this picture too because it's Yale Avenue looking east from the curve at 15th Street. Yale Avenue, of course, was not there. The Yale Avenue project was one of the urban renewal projects that was removed. So what's interesting is this was at the basically end of the line of the Circle Park line. The railway went all the way out to Circle Park. This was before UT would really start developing it. And then, of course, it would change again during the urban renewal project. But so there were houses there at the time. UT would buy up and develop some of this land, and Neyland Stadium would be around this area as well. But if we're looking around, early 1900s, this gives you an idea of just how kind of vacant that area was. And I just like this photo. It was not part of the album, but Jim Thompson took it. And there's streetcar lines in it, and they're clearly building something. And I think it's a great photo representing Knoxville downtown at this time. It's Knoxville Railway and Light Company laying streetcar track at the corner of Gay and Main Street, looking north on Gay Street. You can see the Bijou Theater up there on the left, the sign for the Colonial Hotel, and there was a Ford sales company, of all things, right there. I also like it because, you get a horse in motion. There's a guy on a ladder doing some sort of work on the far right upper corner. And then, I don't know how staged this was, but it's pretty great to see the laborers over here digging the track and doing whatever while the businessmen in their suit coats and suspenders and hats are standing to the side looking over it all. And incidentally, the car barn would have been around where the cars were parked. Would have been just over here. So this is like a terminal. The other one being out on Magnolia Avenue. South Knoxville Island Home Pike, east from Brickyards. I wanted to show this one because this is an interesting case of crowdsourcing on the Knoxville, Tennessee History and Memories Facebook page, which gets a lot of traction. There's a lot of different sort of groups out there that put photos from McClung or videos from Tamas up, and people comment and identify things. Sometimes they're correcting things, sometimes they're trying to correct things and finding out, it was right all along. But in this case, Ron Faulkner, who's like a post there a lot, identified this as being, because it's near the brickyards, he quickly sort of looked at a map and determined this was at the corner of Sevier and Davenport, where it's the possum meeting, the Sunsphere ice cream cone is now. So it's right around that area. And this one's really good in terms of sleuthing. Chilhowie Park, Magnolia Avenue, north from Spruce Street. We've got a lot of Chilhowie Park or Magnolia Avenue photos lines that shows really just how underdeveloped it was out there. And Ron posted this and was like, this doesn't make any sense that it would be in this area. He suspected that house was a Barber house and thought it was the H.H. Kincaid home, and that would put it way off. That was over on Washington Avenue. But looking closer, Nicholas Poker, who actually lives in that area, did some deep diving by using city directories, maps, and old published books like, say, Ron Allen and other people who did a lot of Knoxville history at the time. They really go in and look at these houses. And when Joanna was talking about how she could only spend so much time going into this, that's true of everyone here. This was a back and forth in that Facebook group for a full 2 weeks before it was finally determined by zooming in on the house. And if you'll notice, there's some houses in the back corner too. And it was finally determined that it was 2436 Magnolia, which isn't that, I don't want to blow your spot, but yeah, that's okay. So that's near Kim Trent's house. So if you want to chime in on this or confirm it, look at it later too. We would love to see that. But what's that? It was not Spruce Street. No, I don't think so. Yeah. So, but that remains open, and before we'll put it in a catalog record, which we do patron identified things, we need to confirm it from different sources as well. So it's kind of interesting how these photographs are discussed, and of course the work that Jack and Paul and other organizations do, Jennifer Montgomery and other local history organizations that help us determine this stuff. Speaking of which, Scott Williams with the City Engineering Department saw we were doing this program and sent a PDF of this, Roots and Conditions of the Knoxville Streetcar Railway Lines 1918, which I don't even know if we knew existed. He had it on microfilm, sent a PDF of it, and it's about 30-something pages. Really interesting because it gives you all the lines and the layout. I didn't know there was a circus loop. The circus grounds are right there, so it was named for that, how it went around it. And it also gives a lot of information about the stops and the materials involved in that. And this was 1918, of course, so it's going to change. Earlier streetcar routes are different, and then later ones would be. But it's a great resource, and we're going to be printing it. I don't know if it's in the catalog yet, but we'll print it out, bind it, and put it in the catalog. And so anybody who wants to do research can come and look at this thing. If you are interested in this stuff, I would encourage you to look at it. It's great. And we'll eventually probably put it online as well. And I guess we might, we're running over here, but we've got a few minutes for Q&A if you want. And as we do that, if I can get this to play, we're going to take a look at the video that the Minnick family shot of the last trolley run, August 1st, 1947, as it's running from, as I mentioned, the car barn on Main, all the way down to the Magnolia one. And I don't know if there's anybody in here who even remembers this or tells of this. But this film itself we're not going to see the whole thing. I've just excerpted a few minutes. But it's just sort of this guy who documented, and his family documented Knoxville so well from the 1920s. And his children even bought VHS video cameras and were recording up into the 80s and 90s. An amazing collection of Knoxville history, home movies that's at Tamas. And as we watch this, and it will end with a big finish, field some questions?
Jack, so in your presentation, you mentioned something about there was 53 miles of rail. Was that the maximum amount, or was there more than that?
I don't know for sure. There wasn't much more than that, I think, but I think that was kind of a high point. Yeah. It might have. I got that out of Heart of the Valley, actually, so we can, I don't know if they have records after that, but good question. Yeah.
There was a question online about the houses that were on Main Street. Do any of those still exist?
No. Yeah, no. Yeah, they've all been gone a very long time. One of the last ones was the Atkin House torn down in the 50s.
I just like to say the best thing about riding the trolley was going into that building and crossing where the courthouse is now. That was a thrill for a kid.
Yeah, you're talking about the old, there were three streetcar barns in all, but the last one, the one we'll see torn down, was where they later built the trailway station, right, and across from the courthouse.
Yeah.
And that was built to be an auditorium. And Teddy Roosevelt spoke there in 1904 or something like that.
Really?
And it was the first municipal auditorium, and the city couldn't pay for it and ended up selling it. And it became a skating rink and then a streetcar barn. Just a great big empty building. But do you remember anything about it in particular? I've not heard anybody ever describe it.
Oh, well, you turned left as you were going east on, front of the courthouse, what's that, Main.
Yeah. He was
And
right.
we stopped there, I think maybe they got a new modem in there at that time or something.
But it had a big Kwanzaa
Waiting
type.
in there,
Yeah.
And there's the car
and then
barn.
it pulled back
Yeah.
down Gate Street.
Yeah, there it was, yeah. Yeah, there it is being torn down. This is about, I think this is about 4 years after the last run. But you probably didn't want to see that.
Yeah, but I think it was July 52, and then the one in Magnolia actually wasn't torn down until 75, I think. It stayed up much longer. That's a huge structure to be demolished in downtown. Must have been quite a sight.
Yeah, it obviously was. People took pictures of it. Yeah. Oh, yeah, what?
Where did they get their power from in the early days? Did they have their own
I'm
power
glad
plant?
you asked, because they built, and I meant to show, my biggest regret about this is I meant to show one of the big pictures of the power plant, and it looks like something from Frankenstein or something. It's a giant room with lots and lots of turbines and things in it that was over near Winona, where they had one of the streetcar barns, but also where Cat still is today.
If you want to see it, you can go online to the digital collection, you just type in power plant, Thompson, and
Yeah,
here's what
yeah.
it is.
And was Knoxville electrified in other respects?
There were bits of electricity here and there before that, but that was one of probably the biggest power plant that had been ever built here. There have been a few little things that powered one thing or another. Some people out on Keystone Pike didn't have connections to the city power and just had a little power plant on the creek, on Third Creek, and they would have create their own electricity there. But
I just noticed that most of these pictures, they had power lines that were
Yeah.
already pretty developed
Yeah.
where they were laying track.
Yeah.
So those were later.
they were there, I think. Well, the big power plant was built in 1905, but I think there was definitely power generated. I'm not sure where McAdoo got his power in 1890, but it was probably a smaller version of that power plant.
We got time for one more.
How was the handover to buses? Was it sort of, did people think buses would replace streetcars and people would still be doing public transit, just a surrender to it?
Yeah, it was not all at once. It was gradual. Buses were introduced, I think, in 1928, and some people liked them. They could go places streetcars couldn't. Another thing, and the reason that they tried the bus plan for the railroad tire trolley on Lions View was to give it a chance to, if a tree fell or something, you could maybe drive around it. Where a trolley is stuck, you have to, as I know, from riding the St. Charles line in New Orleans, a car is in front of you, you can't move until that car moves, and if it's stuck, you're stuck too. But that was one drawback of the streetcar, the steel rail streetcar system. But yeah, buses were introduced in 1928, I think, but we're still. I think after 1947 they were catching on more, and they became more not a for-profit thing, but a city funded thing after that. But I think in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 30s and 40s anyway, you could take either a streetcar or a bus. But more streetcars had closed by the 40s, and I think there were more places that had bus lines than streetcar lines.
Jack, what used to be the KUB building, now the Tombrus building, just
Yeah.
the street. Didn't they have some generators in there? Wasn't that Knoxville Power? and
That was their headquarters, and whether they had actual generators there, I'm not
I
sure.
thought maybe on Sanborn I had seen some
You might be right.
generators, and maybe that provided power
You might be
for
right.
Rock Central down there.
Yeah, you might well be right. Yeah.
Did they, had the streets been paved with bricks and they moved the brick to lay the tracks?
Well,
Or did they,
And
or they just?
they usually just tore it up, as we found with McAdoo. I think we don't have a better description of how they built a streetcar than the one that led to the riot. And they tore it, to the extent they had to. They would,
Yeah, is that what's happening here? I mean, there's like that big thing they're building, so I don't know.
All right. Look.
Yeah, thank you. So if you want to see the book, it's actually over here. Thank you.